I thought museum internships were supposed to be safe, quiet, predictable. But the night I carried one undocumented artifact out of storage, something came with me, and it didn't stay at the museum. The first thing you should know is that I didn't take the night shift at the museum because I liked history or because I believed in preserving the past. I took it because I was running from my present. And in a town like Salem, Massachusetts, the past has a way of noticing when you're weak enough to listen. I was 29, recently divorced, and desperate for quiet after months of sleeping on a friend's couch while pretending I was fine. The Peabody Essex Museum wasn't hiring night guards directly, but the city contracted security through a third party, and my resume military police background, clean record, no drugs got me in. The pay was decent, the hours were long, and the building emptied out completely after midnight, which sounded perfect at the time. On my first night, the supervisor handed me a ring of keys, a radio that crackled more than it worked, and a laminated floor map of the museum with my patrol route highlighted in yellow. "Stick to the route," he said, tapping the map with a blunt finger. "Don't freelance. Cameras are old. If something looks off, call it in." He paused, then added, half joking, "And if you hear anything, well, this is Salem." I laughed politely, but the word lingered longer than it should have. Salem isn't just a town. It's a brand, one built on the witch trials of 1692, on paranoia and fear, and the official execution of 19 people, based on accusations we now recognize as hysteria. You can't grow up in Massachusetts without knowing that. And you can't work nights in Salem without feeling like the air remembers. The museum itself is a maze of old and new historic houses grafted onto modern glass. Galleries stacked like layers of sediment. My job was simple. Walk the route every hour, scan the doors, check the motion sensors, and log anything unusual. The first week passed without incident. Aside from the usual building noises, the tick of cooling pipes, the distant thump of HVAC systems, the kind of sounds you stop noticing after a while. It was on the 8th night that I noticed the exhibit that wasn't on the map. I was halfway through my second round when I realized my steps sounded wrong, softer somehow, like the carpet under my boots had changed texture. I stopped, shined my flashlight at the floor, and frowned. The map said I should have been passing the Maritime Gallery with its ship models and navigation instruments. But the walls around me were darker, the lighting dimmer, the glass cases narrower. Ahead of me was a single room, maybe 20 feet long, with a sign mounted beside the entrance. The sign was plain white, black serif font, no logo. It read, "Court of Oyer and Terminer, 1692. I knew enough history to recognize the name immediately. The Court of Oyer and Terminer was the special tribunal established in Salem to hear the witchcraft cases. The court that sent people to the gallows based on spectral evidence and dreams. It was dissolved later, that same year, after Governor William Phipps intervened, when accusations started reaching too close to the colony's elite. There was nothing about it on my map. I stood there longer than I should have, my flashlight beam trembling slightly as it moved across the glass. Inside the room was a single exhibit, a long wooden table, rough-hewn and scarred, surrounded by straight-backed chairs. On the table lay documents replicas. I assumed inked pages filled with cramped handwriting, a judge's seal pressed into yellowed wax. The air felt heavier in that room, not colder exactly, but dense, like humidity before a storm. My radio crackled once, then went dead silent. I told myself it was a temporary exhibit, something new they hadn't updated the maps for yet, and logged it as unlisted gallery, signage present, before continuing my route. I didn't mention the feeling in my chest, the sudden pressure behind my eyes, because I didn't want to sound like the kind of guy who saw ghosts on his second week. The next night, the room was still there. Same sign, same table, same documents. But something was different. One of the chairs at the table had been pulled back slightly, angled away as if someone had just stood up. I stopped at the threshold, my flashlight catching the shadow beneath the chair legs, and waited. Nothing moved. I stepped inside, my boots making no sound on the floor, and felt that pressure again. Stronger now, like a hand pressing against my sternum. I reached out and touched the table. The wood was warm. I yanked my hand back, heart pounding, and laughed under my breath, telling myself it was just my imagination, that old buildings retained heat, that stress did weird things to perception. Still, when I logged my round, my handwriting was shaky. Over the next few nights, the changes continued, subtle but undeniable. A document shifted position. A chair turned slightly. Once, I could have sworn I heard a low murmur, like voices behind a wall. But when I stopped and listened, there was nothing. I asked another guard, a guy named Tom who'd been there for years, if he knew about the Court of Oyer and Terminer exhibit. He stared at me for a second too long before shaking his head. "No idea what you're talking about," he said. "There's no room like that on my route." When I pressed him, he laughed it off. "You sure you're not thinking of the Witch Trials Gallery? That's on the second floor." I showed him my map. He showed me his. Mine had a blank space where his showed a storage corridor. That was when I should have escalated it, gone to my supervisor, demanded an explanation. Instead, I kept quiet. Part of it was pride. I didn't want to be the new guy making a fuss. Part of it was something harder to admit. The room pulled at me. Being there felt like standing on the edge of a confession. Like, if I stayed long enough, I'd understand something I'd been missing about myself. On the 12th night, I found a name I recognized on one of the documents. Rebecca, nurse. She was one of the women executed during the trials. A 71-year-old grandmother, widely regarded as pious and kind. Convicted despite public outcry. Her trial records are real, preserved in archives, a testament to how fear can override reason. Seeing her name there, in that room that wasn't supposed to exist, made my stomach twist. I started doing research on my days off, reading about the trials, the court, the judges, William Stoughton, Samuel Sewall. Sewall famously apologized years later, standing in church and admitting his guilt in the proceedings. I wondered what kind of apology the room was waiting for. The dreams started soon after. I'd fall asleep and find myself standing in that room. The table surrounded by figures in shadow, their faces indistinct, but their eyes burning. They'd speak, but I couldn't understand the words, only the weight of them. The accusation. I'd wake up gasping, my chest aching, my sheets damp with sweat. On the 15th night, the chair at the head of the table was occupied. Not by a person, not fully. The impression of one. The seat was indented, the back creaking softly, as if bearing weight. I froze in the doorway, my flashlight beam shaking so badly it blurred. "Hello?" I whispered, hating how small my voice sounded. The radio crackled to life then, A burst of static followed by a single word, distorted but unmistakable. Guilty. I ran. I didn't care about protocol or professionalism. I turned and ran down the corridor, my boots pounding loudly now, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty building. I didn't stop until I reached the security office, where I locked the door and sat on the floor, back against the wall, breathing hard. I told myself I'd report it in the morning, that this was beyond me, beyond any paycheck. But when morning came, and the museum filled with light and tourists and school groups, the room was gone. Where it had been was a storage corridor, just like Tom's map showed. No sign, no table, no documents. My supervisor listened to my report with a neutral expression, then suggested I take a few days off. Night shifts can mess with your head, he said gently. I almost believed him. Almost. I quit 2 weeks later. I moved out of Salem, found another security job in a different town, a different state. The dreams faded, slowly. Life moved on, but last month, I visited the Massachusetts State Archives in Boston for unrelated reasons. And on a whim, I asked to see records related to the court of Oyer and Terminer. The archivist brought out a box, old and carefully preserved. Inside were trial documents, judges' notes, petitions for mercy. And at the bottom, a floor plan, a sketch of a courtroom layout, dated 1692, drawn by an unknown hand. The table, the chairs, the dimensions. It matched the room perfectly. Scribbled in the margin was a note, faded but legible. This chamber to be sealed when justice is done. It never was, and sometimes, I think, it opens itself, waiting for someone who needs to hear the verdict, not for the dead, but for the living. The ones who believe they're only guarding history, unaware that history is still very much awake, and still deciding who deserves to be judged. The email arrived at 4:12 p.m., stamped with the museum's internal header, and a subject line so plain, it almost felt deliberate. Exhibit 317, staff reminder. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another routine memo about visitor flow or artifact handling. But one line stopped me cold. Staff are advised not to spend extended time alone in Exhibit 317. Pairing is recommended at all times. No explanation. No signature beyond collections administration. I worked at the Field Museum in Chicago, and nothing like that had ever been circulated before. Not in the 5 years I'd been there. Museums run on procedures, redundancies, and transparency. Vague warnings didn't fit the culture. I should explain why I cared so much. I wasn't a senior curator or a security guard chasing overtime. I was an assistant collections archivist, the kind of invisible employee who cataloged objects most visitors never saw. I took the job because after my father died, leaving behind a house full of unlabeled relics from his own career as a historian, I developed an obsession with order. Objects made sense to me. They stayed where you put them. People didn't. Exhibit 317 was new, quietly installed in a side wing dedicated to early North American belief systems. The public description was harmless enough. Ritual objects of the upper Midwest, 17th and 18th century. But internally, it had a different file name. 317. Restricted context display. That alone was unusual. On the day it opened, my supervisor, Karen, asked me to audit the documentation. Just the paperwork, she said. not meeting my eyes. "Don't linger," I laughed, assuming she was joking, until I saw she wasn't smiling. The exhibit consisted of one glass case in a dimly lit room, isolated from the larger gallery. Inside the case was a small bundle, wrapped in discolored cloth, tied with what looked like sinew. No label, no explanatory text beyond a date range and a location. Northern Illinois, C. 1680, 1710. I recognized the period immediately. It overlapped with the years following La Salle's expeditions, when French traders and Jesuit missionaries documented interactions with Algonquian-speaking tribes. Some of those records still exist, preserved in archives and letters, describing objects used in what missionaries dismissed as sorcery or devil worship. One name surfaced repeatedly in my mind: the Jesuit Relations, a collection of annual reports sent back to France, some of which described ritual bundles believed to house spirits or curses. Standing alone in that room, I felt an inexplicable pressure behind my eyes, like the onset of a headache. The air smelled faintly metallic, though the HVAC system hummed steadily overhead. I told myself it was imagination, logged the inventory number, and left. Over the next few weeks, I noticed small things. Colleagues avoided the room. When Exhibit 317 came up in conversation, voices dropped. One intern transferred departments after a single shift monitoring visitor behavior there. When I asked why, she shrugged and said, "It just felt wrong," then laughed nervously like she was embarrassed by her own answer. The email warning was quietly resent, this time with a note attached: "Please acknowledge receipt." Still, no explanation. My motivation to understand shifted from professional curiosity to something more personal. My father had believed deeply that objects carried stories beyond what we recorded, that context mattered as much as content. He used to say, "History isn't dead, it's just patient." After his death, sorting through his notes, I found references to Midwestern folklore. I'd never heard him mention aloud accounts of ritual bundles meant to bind wrongdoing, to contain the consequences of violence, so a community could survive. One entry cited a French trader's journal from 1697, describing a village near the Des Plaines River, where a thing was sealed away after a massacre, never to be opened again. The Field Museum's exhibit location matched the region. The tension built slowly, the way it does when you start noticing patterns you can't unsee. Security logs showed motion alerts in Exhibit 317 after hours, always brief, never corroborated by cameras. The cameras themselves glitched frequently in that room, frames dropping for seconds at a time. Maintenance blamed outdated wiring. One night, staying late to finish a database migration, I passed the room and saw the light inside was on. I knew it shouldn't be. The gallery closed at 6. Against my better judgment, I stepped inside. The case looked unchanged, but the cloth bundle seemed tighter, as if the knots had been pulled recently. The pressure in my head intensified, accompanied by a low ringing in my ears. I thought I heard whispering, but it was too indistinct to parse, more like the sound of breath through fabric. I backed out quickly, heart racing, and sent a report to Karen. She replied an hour later with 2 words: "Noted, thank you." No follow-up. Sleep became difficult after that. I dreamed of hands wrapping cloth, pulling knots, fingers stained dark. In the dreams, I was always watching, never participating. but I woke with a sense of guilt, like I'd been complicit by proximity. One morning, a colleague named Marcus didn't show up for work. He'd been tasked with updating the exhibit's environmental controls and had spent several hours alone in the room the previous day. Despite the warning, HR said he'd taken personal leave. A week later, his desk was cleared. Officially, he'd resigned. Unofficially, someone mentioned he'd been hospitalized for severe anxiety and auditory hallucinations. I started digging deeper, using my access to restricted archives. Buried in acquisition records was the truth. The bundle had been recovered in the 1,930 seconds during a Works Progress Administration survey, taken from a private collection with no clear chain of custody. The collector claimed his grandfather acquired it from a missionary estate. The original notes included a translation of an Algonquian account recorded secondhand, describing the object as a binding created after a violent betrayal between tribes and traders, meant to hold the watching part of the dead so it could not follow the living. The instructions were explicit. It was never to be unwrapped, never to be displayed, and never to be viewed alone, because isolation was believed to weaken the social boundary that kept it contained. A 1,701 French letter corroborated part of this, mentioning a wrapped judgment hidden away after bloodshed near Fort Street. Louis, warning that it calls to those who listen without witness. The museum had broken every rule, driven by the belief that context and glass were enough. The night everything culminated, a late-season snowstorm kept most staff away. I was one of the few left, working overtime to finalize a report. The lights flickered briefly around 9 p.m., and my phone buzzed with a new email. Same subject line: Exhibit 317. Immediate action required. The body contained only one sentence: do not enter Exhibit 317 alone. I stood up, my chest tight, already knowing the light in that room would be on. It was. The door stood ajar, the hum of the building louder than usual, like it was straining. I should have waited, called security, found another person. Instead, driven by a need I still don't fully understand, maybe to prove that knowledge could protect me, I stepped inside. The case door was open. The bundle lay partially unwrapped. The cloth loosened. The sinew frayed. The whispering was clear now. Not words exactly, but a rhythm that felt like accusation. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I saw flashes that weren't mine. A riverbank, firelight, figures arguing in languages I didn't know. Then violence, sudden and irreversible. I understood then what the binding was for. Not to contain a ghost, but to contain responsibility. To hold the weight of what had been done so the living could move on. Alone, I felt that weight settle onto me, pressing, asking to be acknowledged. I don't remember leaving the room. I woke up hours later, in the security office, wrapped in a blanket, Karen standing over me with red-rimmed eyes. The exhibit closed permanently the next day. Officially, for conservation reasons, the bundle was removed from public record and placed back into storage, with updated protocols that mirrored the original warnings almost word for word. Marcus never returned. I resigned a month later. Sometimes, late at night, I think about that object sitting in darkness, wrapped again, waiting. The Field Museum still stands, proud and orderly. But I know now that some exhibits aren't meant to educate. They're meant to remind us that history isn't just something we observe. Sometimes, if you look at it alone for too long, it looks back and asks you to carry what others couldn't. The first night, I realized something had followed me home from the museum. It announced itself in the most mundane way possible. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps pacing the hallway outside my apartment bedroom at exactly 3:17 a.m., the same time I had been locking up the archival storage room at the Wisconsin Historical Museum in Madison just hours earlier. I lay there staring at the ceiling, counting each step, telling myself it was my upstairs neighbor or the building settling. But the rhythm was wrong, measured, patient, like whoever was walking had nowhere else to be and all the time in the world. I should explain why I was even in that storage room to begin with. I was a graduate intern, 23, desperate to prove I belonged in the world of public history after growing up, watching my mother bounce between jobs while telling me stability came from respectable institutions. Museums, to me, were safe places, controlled places, climate-regulated, cataloged, labeled. I believed deeply that if you documented something well enough, it couldn't hurt you anymore. That belief is what made me volunteer for the project no one else wanted, digitizing uncatalogued items from a private donation tied to Wisconsin's territorial period. The collection came from the estate of a local family whose lineage traced back to Fort Blue Mounds, a settlement that existed during the Black Hawk War of 1832, a conflict that is very real, very documented, and still quietly painful in this state. The war ended with the Battle of Bad Axe, a massacre rather than a battle, and many artifacts from that era were taken without regard for what they meant to the people they belonged to. The donation paperwork was thin, just a handwritten note from the donor's grandfather claiming the items had been kept for safekeeping. That phrase stuck with me even then. Most of the objects were mundane buttons, tools, letters, but one item didn't fit. It was a small wooden box, no larger than a shoebox, sealed with iron nails and wrapped in brittle leather strips. No accession number, no description, just a penciled tag tied to the handle that read, "Do not open. Returned once already." I assumed returned meant re-donated, maybe loaned out and brought back. I logged it as restricted pending review and stored it on the lowest shelf, telling myself I'd flag it for my supervisor in the morning. But as the days passed, no one followed up. My emails went unanswered. The box stayed, and I started to notice things. The storage room felt colder near that shelf, despite the environmental monitors reading normal. The overhead lights flickered only when I was working nearby. Once, while photographing a ledger, I heard a soft knocking sound, 3 slow taps coming from somewhere behind me. When I turned around, the room was empty, silent, the sound swallowed by the hum of the building. I told myself it was pipes, old wood contracting, anything but what my instincts whispered. I didn't grow up believing in the supernatural, but I did grow up listening to stories about the land, remembering what was done to it. A sentiment echoed in many native oral histories from the region. One documented Ho-Chunk account describes spirits lingering near places of unresolved violence, especially where objects tied to the dead were removed. That account is real. It's archived at the University of Wisconsin. I remembered reading it in undergrad, thinking it was poetic, not literal. The night I worked late enough to miss the last bus, I offered to finish logging just one more item so the trip felt worth it. It was the box. Against every protocol drilled into me, I carried it to the processing table. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The smell hit me first, a mix of damp earth and old smoke. The leather bindings felt warm, almost pliable, under my gloves. As I examined it, the lights dimmed briefly, and I felt that same pressure behind my eyes I'd started getting whenever I stood too close to the shelf. Then I heard it, breathing, not loud, not panicked, just steady, close, like someone standing right behind my shoulder. I spun around, heart pounding, and saw nothing. But the breathing didn't stop. It followed me as I locked up, as I walked out into the cold Madison night, as I rode the bus home staring at my reflection in the dark window, half expecting to see someone else's face looking back. That was when the footsteps started at home, always at 3:17 a.m., always pacing the same distance. Sometimes, faintly, I heard that breathing again, right outside my bedroom door. I stopped sleeping. I started making mistakes at work. One morning, my supervisor finally called me in. She looked exhausted, older than she had weeks before. When I mentioned the box, her expression changed. She pulled a file from her desk and showed me a scanned document, an 1,833 militia inventory list, noting an item taken from the Blue Mounds site, believed to contain remains or effects of the slain, ordered removed by Captain Dixon. Beneath it, a later note, dated 1,891, recorded the item being returned to the area after disturbances plagued the family that kept it. Returned once already. The box had never belonged in storage. It had been moved, taken, displayed, and every time it came back. "We don't put it out anymore," she said quietly. "We keep it until it can go back." I asked her back where. She didn't answer. That night, the footsteps reached my bedroom door and stopped. The handle rattled once, gently, as if testing. I sat up, shaking. And in that moment, I understood. What had followed me wasn't attached to the box itself, but to the act of carrying it, of removing it from where it waited. I quit the internship the next day and drove the box back to Blue Mounds State Park. Guided by directions my supervisor texted, without comment. I buried it near a documented site referenced in early settler journals, a place historians believe was used as a temporary encampment during the war. The air felt lighter immediately. The footsteps stopped. Life went on. But sometimes, when I read about museums acquiring new collections, or see interns proudly posting about behind-the-scenes access, I think about that box and what it carried. Not a ghost, not a curse, but the insistence that some things don't want to be studied, cataloged, or understood by strangers. They just want to stay where they were left. And if you're the one who moves them, even with the best intentions, you might find that history isn't done walking with you yet. Museums teach us that history belongs behind glass, that once something is labeled, archived, and sealed away, it's harmless. But some things were never meant to be studied. Some were only meant to be left alone. And if you're the one who moves them, don't be surprised when history decides to walk home with you.